Hi, am I audible enough? Okay. A very good morning to all of you, and thank you for being here on a nice, lovely Sunday morning. And a very warm welcome to our chief guest, Dr. Vikram Sampath, and of course, Mr. Vikram Limsay. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Aishwarya Pethe Kulkarni, and I'm honored to take you through this book launch today. So, we have some exciting giveaways for today, and I'll tell you more in a minute. You might have to work for it, but I'll explain as we go on. So, to begin with, may I please request Dr. Uday Kulkarni to accompany Dr. Vikram Sampath and Mr. Limsay and grace us with their presence on stage. While they settle in, a quick note on the aforementioned giveaways. During the course of the event, I'll be asking you a few questions, and if you're able to give me a correct response with, and the fastest finger first, we will be giving you a signed copy of one of Dr. Uday Kulkarni's books. Louder? Thank you, gentlemen. I now request Dr. Uday Kulkarni to felicitate Dr. Vikram Sampath. We will now have the books on stage as well in a minute. I request our chief guest to unveil the book, The Mastery of Hindustan, Triumphs and Travails of Madhav Rao Pesha. Now, before I introduce Dr. Uday Kulkarni, here's your chance to receive a signed copy of one of his books. And remember, please raise your hand and fastest finger first. The question I'm going to ask, which year did the Maratha army first enter Delhi? I see that was the first gentleman there.
Hello?
Yep.
Hello? Yes. I believe the correct answer is 1737.
That's incorrect. I saw someone raise a hand here. This.
Bajirao was 13 years old when his father entered Delhi. So this was in the year 1730.
Close. Not. No. Okay. Yeah, that's incorrect as well, unfortunately. Do we have an answer there? Yeah, sure. No. No. Where? Sorry, who did I miss? Here.
1857.
Sorry?
1857?
No. No. Okay, one more. One last one there.
So the people shouldn't do Google.
Yes, that's not allowed. Oh, there we go. Yeah? Okay. All right. First one remains.
I'll give a clue for that. It was the first time they entered was before Bajirao became the Peshwa. And anybody who's read an era of Bajirao will get the answer. Sorry to sound like a history class, but it is 1719.
1719, yes. Okay. So the first one remains unclaimed, but there'll be more opportunities. You were closest, yes. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for that. Now, Dr. Uday Kulkarni's extensively researched and meticulously constructed books are a fantastic read, as I'm sure many of you can vouch for that, and a great addition to our understanding of Maratha history. Dr. Uday Kulkarni is a graduate of the Armed Forces Medical College, Pune, and is a surgeon with postgraduate degree from Bombay University. We have a few AFMCites in the audience today. He's also a veteran from the Indian Armed Forces, having retired from the Indian Navy and in the rank of Surgeon Commander. He has thereafter practiced as a surgeon in Pune for over 2.5 decades and been a teacher and guide for postgraduate students. His passion, however, has been history, and he wrote his first book on Maratha and Mughal history in a school notebook when he was just 12. It was only in 2010 that he felt that the way Indian history was presented lacked a scientific, unbiased approach, and wrote his first book, Solstice at Panipat, on the Third Battle of Panipat. The book is now in its 6th reprint. He then discovered Maratha documents lost for 200 years in London, which had priceless letters and bakhars. He translated the Bakhar of Panipat from these papers, and the next book was a return to the start of the 18th century to write the era of Bajirao, followed by another book that was from original manuscript documents that had never been published. This was James Wales, artist and antiquarian in the time of Peshwa Savai Madhavrao, which was in a coffee table format. The period of 1735 to 1761 featured next in Dr. Kulkarni's The Extraordinary Epoch of Nana Saheb Peshwa. This was followed by the Maratha Century, which was a 300-page overview of the 175-year-long Maratha period. The 7th book is The Mastery of Hindustan, Triumphs and Travails of Madhavrao Peshwa, which is being launched today, and covers the turbulent period north and south in the 12 years after Panipat. He has also brought out the Peshwa trilogy, which covers the 18th century till 1772 in great detail. With extensive use of archival material, maps, and photographs of people, places, and documents, all the books have unfolded the 18th century for the readers of Indian history in great detail. Dr. Kulkarni has done a postgraduate course in communication and journalism in Pune University in 1998, in which he secured distinction and stood first in the university. He has won several awards for his work in Maratha history, such as the Sadashiv Rao Bhau Puraskar, the Abasaheb Mujumdar Puraskar, the prestigious Shiv Smruti Puraskar, awarded on Fort Raigad annually, to name a few. The Marathi translations of his books have also won successive awards. He has been awarded the Oration by the Armed Forces Medical College at its Diamond Jubilee, and he has been elected a Fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland in 2021. I now welcome him to say a few words.
Thanks, Aishwarya, for that nice introduction. At the outset, it's wonderful to be at Bangalore for a book launch on the Marathas. For this place was one of the cradles of the Maratha kingdom. You might be surprised to hear that. Because Shahaji Raje Bhosle, who was that time a noble in the Bijapur kingdom, was awarded Bangalore as his Jagir. And the two Jagirs of Shahaji Raje at that time, one was in Pune and one was Bangalore. His father stayed in Bangalore while he was sent to Pune to look after the Jagir there. So these two cities, which are linked together with the very beginning of the Maratha Empire, as that is where the whole story began. And although Shahji's son Venkoji moved later on to Tanjavur, the Marathas kept their eye on the areas around Bangalore, which they claimed were the Swarajya of Shahji Raje as well as Shivaji Maharaj. And therefore, the invasions of the Marathas were to get back that Swarajya which had been awarded to Shahji and which had been captured by Shivaji when he came down south for his Dakshin Digvijay, and on the way back he is said to have captured Bangalore. That was around 1677 or so. So that is why for 100 years this region was constantly claimed by the Marathas as their Swarajya. Now, launching this seventh non-fiction account of the 18th century history is no less a pleasure than when I launched my first book as a novice historian in 2011. And it is not that bearing a seventh child is in any way trims the excitement of the occasion. And this book, to carry the metaphor a little further, also was a culmination of many months of hard work. Now, this book, The Mastery of Hindustan, is a book which I planned to write immediately after my first book, which was The Battle of Panipat. I thought I'll write the post-Panipat period of 12 years, and probably I wouldn't have gone much further beyond, and by now I would have finished Maratha history till the year 1818, and I would have been relaxing. But Ninad Bedekar, who was an eminent historian in Maharashtra, he advised me that after this book you must go back and start from the beginning of the 18th century, and that's what led to the era of Bajirao. And then I've been following the chronology with Nana Sahib and now this book dealing with Madhavrao's period. And these three books, the era of Bajirao, Nana Sahib and Madhavrao, cover the period of the first four Peshwas. And that was the main Peshwai, as it is called, because after Madhavrao we have what is called the Uttar Peshwai, because the Peshwas actually, like the Chhatrapati's power came to devolved onto the Peshwa's power devolved onto the ministers and the chiefs of the Maratha Empire after Madhavrao's period. So that is called the Uttar Peshwai. The Peshwa was not really in control after Madhavrao's time. And therefore these three books are put together as a trilogy which cover the main Peshwai period from Balaji Vishwanath, Bajirao, Nana Sahib and Madhavrao Peshwa. And because I went back to Bajirao, I have just finished this period after almost 12 years of writing. And it's actually better that way, because it's often said that you write better history when you get a little older. And maybe that's what has probably helped me. Now, let me come back to the backstory of the Maratha period before this book, for those who are not aware of it. The Maratha power, as I say several times, is the first indigenous power in India after many centuries of foreign rule. I use these words very carefully. By foreign rule, I mean Turco-Persian rule, which was prevailing in the north and in the south from the 13th and 14th century onwards. The reason I call them foreign rule is because they had a foreign language as the state language. They had a foreign faith which was given preference over the indigenous faiths at that time, and there was a certain discrimination against the native population. Now this discrimination was social, economic, political, religious, on all four fronts, and I can give you examples of all these. So this was what actually spurred Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj to begin his enterprise for Swarajya in the 16th century, to gain the respect and re-establish a kingdom where his people can live with honor. And therefore, even his original seal, which was made when he was just 16 years of age, was in Sanskrit as against to the Persian seals of his parents. And in the last line of that, he says that my aim is to have benediction for all. He did not discriminate between who is going to be amongst his the praja of his kingdom. He even-handed in this treatment for all of them. Now, one finds that before his death, he came down to the south and he reached the banks of the Kaveri because he went to meet his brother who was in Tanjavur, and he captured several places on the way, including the fort of Jinji, which he fortified and repaired and strengthened immeasurably, and which served them in good stead in the years to come. Now, a few years after his death in 1680, one finds that the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, who had just completed 25 years as the emperor in Delhi, came down with a huge army to the Deccan. His initial aim was chasing his son, who had rebelled against him. But when he came down here, his long-held ambition as the Viceroy of the Deccan was to extinguish the kingdoms of Bijapur, Golconda and the Marathas. And by 1685 and 1687, he had managed to get rid of the Bijapur and the Golconda kingdoms. And in 1689, he managed to capture Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj, and he very cruelly put him to death, which is very well documented. And this spurred a Maratha revival, a fight back, which occupied the remaining 20 years of Aurangzeb's life till his death in 1707 at Ahmednagar. And it was this fight back which actually created a momentum that took the Marathas to the north across the Yamuna. Now, after the death of Aurangzeb, the succession wars which took place between his sons, that resulted in the withdrawal of the Mughals to the north, while the Marathas on the other hand, the momentum they had gained in these years took them to the north, and in 1719 they first appeared in Delhi. Now that was because the emperor there, Farrukhsiyar, was at odds with his own ministers, the Sayyid brothers, and the Hussain Ali was the viceroy of the Deccan, who invited the Maratha army that please come with me, I want to displace this emperor. So 30,000 Maratha troops under the then Peshwa, Balaji Vishwanath, and the young Bajirao, who was that time just 17 or 18 years of age, they went to the north. 30,000 troops were in Delhi, just 12 years after the death of Aurangzeb, and you find they changed the emperor. Farrukhsiyar is deposed on the strength of Maratha arms by Hussain Ali, and a puppet emperor is put in his place. And this puppet emperor gave the sanads or the legitimacy to the Marathas to collect the south of the 6.5 subas of the Deccan, along with their Swarajya, which was in the south. And it was the basis of this document that from the titular Mughal emperor that the Marathas kept claiming the 6.5 subas of the Deccan for the next 150 years that they remained in this region. So this was the context in which you must understand why the Marathas came south. You will find that after Bajirao came on the scene, he expanded his kingdom right up to the Chambal and the Yamuna in the north, and there were Marathas coming right up to the Tungabhadra in the south. And Delhi's emperor became more and as they became weaker and weaker. Like Muhammad Shah was known as Rangila, he was more interested in his more colorful exploits, music and dance and those kind of things. And administration was neglected. And in 1737, you find Bajirao at the doorstep of Delhi. And here he writes to his brother that I could have burned the suburbs of the city, and I could have attacked Delhi at that point in time, because the Mughal armies were far to the south, 100,000 armies were to the south of Delhi, but he had passed through them and reached Delhi. But he says Delhi is a Mahasthal, and to burn the suburbs would mean to break the cord of diplomacy. And his aim of reaching Delhi was to show the emperor that I can reach there, so the emperor is forced to cede the province of Malwa to the Marathas, which was a very important bridging province between North and South India at that time. Now, from here the Mughals kept on becoming more and more weak and timid, and their weakness was so great that when Ahmad Shah Abdali and Nadir Shah later on attacked Delhi, they were literally supine. In 1748, you find Muhammad Shah inviting Nana Sahib Peshwa to Delhi to help him face Ahmad Shah Abdali. And this arrangement was formalized in 1752 when the Mughal emperor at that time actually signed an agreement which is called an Ahadnama, a copy of which you can find in the Maratha Museum in Pune, where he agreed to cede certain provinces, the revenue of certain provinces to the Maratha in exchange for internal protection from internal and external enemies of the emperor. And that is what actually led to the Marathas taking responsibility for the protection of the Mughals, who are their one-time adversaries, and the protection of Delhi. Now, with Ahmad Shah Abdali's invasions continuing, you find that the Marathas were called upon to undertake this responsibility which they had signed for. And in 1757, when after Abdali's fourth invasion, which was a very brutal one, all of Delhi was looted. There was a raid in Mathura and Vrindavan where hundreds of thousands of pilgrims and sadhus were killed, and it is said the waters of the Yamuna ran red and so on. So from that point, the Marathas came in 1758, they took Delhi, but they didn't stop there. They entered Punjab. Abdali's son was at Lahore. He chased them out of Lahore. And you find the four cities that are in present-day Pakistan, Lahore, Attock, Peshawar and Multan, came under Maratha occupation, along with some Mughal chiefs, some Sikhs were also accompanying them. And that remained under Maratha occupation for a good 18 months after that. And a very significant event at that time was that the Shah of Iran wrote to Raghunath Rao, who was leading the Maratha army, that between the two of us, let us crush Abdali, who is in Afghanistan, who is known as the father of Afghanistan to this day, and you take Kabul while I will take Kandahar. To which Raghunath Rao writes to the Peshwa in Pune that, but I say, though this offer has come, Kandahar was part of Hindustan till Alamgir's time. Actually, he made a mistake. It was part of Hindustan till Shah Jahan's time. And why should we now give it away to the Persian king? So that was the kind of boundaries which were political and cultural boundaries of India, which the Marathas envisaged, which was very surprising considering their base was far in the south, in Pune and Satara and those kind of places. So this national vision, it was a kind of enunciation of a political India, or what the boundaries of a political India ought to be. And this is what later on was even reaffirmed in the Battle of Panipat, because Abdali recovered from his troubles in Afghanistan. He came marching down here at the invitation of his Rohilla allies. The Rohillas are basically first or second generation Afghans who have come and settled in India, and they were usually living in either in the Ganga Jamuna Doab or beyond the Ganga in the Najibabad region, near the Haridwar Najibabad region. So they invited Abdali that today the entire region here is occupied by the Marathas, the Jats and the Sikhs, and the actual letter by Shah Waliullah, who was the theologian in Delhi, to Ahmad Shah Abdali, was said, the sound of azan cannot be heard anymore because these three people have come here and they've occupied all the places. So please come here, you are a great emperor, and drive them out from these places. So you can see history is very communal. It's not something that you can whitewash and brush under the carpet. And if you have the maturity, you have to take it head on. Now, this is what led to Abdali's fifth invasion, and that was in 1759, December. Dattaji Shinde was defending Delhi at that time, and Dattaji Shinde was killed while defending Delhi. And then, when Dattaji was defeated, Holkar was separately defeated also, and that led to a huge Maratha army coming from the south in the defense of India's frontiers and to reclaim Delhi for the Mughals. In the hunt for allies at that time, there were no allies who came to join the Marathas. For a short period, the Jats joined them, but when they came to Delhi and they found that Sadashivrao Bhau was not handing over the city of Delhi and the Red Fort to them, they abandoned the Marathas and went back. The Rajputs did not join them, and finally they had to fight Abdali alone at Panipat. And I will not go into that because that probably would be a separate lecture in itself. But eventually that led to the Battle of Panipat on 14th of January 1761. And from whichever point in the 18th century you look at the history of that period, this battle stands at the center of it. And at least three of my books have dealt with the Battle of Panipat from various points of view. So this impact that this battle and its aftermath has its influence on the India of today. Because after the battle, Ahmad Shah Abdali realized the strength of the Marathas, because they came within an inch of winning the battle around midday on that day. And when he left, he wrote a letter to the Peshwa saying, I hand over the administration of Hindustan to you. I will agree with your nomination of Shah Alam as the emperor of Delhi. Now, Shah Alam, of course, was an absentee emperor. In 1758, he ran away from Delhi and went to the east. And he was that time in asylum under British protection. So he remained there for 1758 to 1771. You find Delhi is a city without an emperor, and it is under the control of Najib-ud-Dawla, to whom the administration is handed over. The Maratha Peshwa Nana Sahib was very ill. He died 6 months after the Battle of Panipat. And that is where this book, The Master of Hindustan, starts, because that is a time when enemies from all sides, in the south it was Hyder Ali, who had just usurped the kingdom of Mysore, and he had been almost defeated in 1759, 1760 when the campaign of the Marathas was going on. The news of Panipat came and the Marathas had to withdraw from that place. The Nizam, who had been defeated in 1759 at Udgir, he came back with a vengeance. In 1763, two-thirds of the city of Pune was burned down by the Nizam. Shuja-ud-Dawla from the north crossed the Jamuna, came down, he captured the cities of Jhansi. You find the Maharaja of Jaipur crossed over and attacked Malwa, and Mallara Holkar had to fight with him at Mangrove, where he was defeated. So from all sides it was and besides there was a battle within Madhavarao's own household, when his uncle said that I would like to wield the power. So from all these difficulties, I call that first part of the book the abyss into which the Marathas had descended, and how that recovery took place. is what the whole book is about. At the same time, you find the English, having won the Battle of Plassey, were creeping further westwards from Bengal, and thanks to Shuja-ud-Dawla, Mir Qasim and Shah Alam opposing them, they lost successive battles, finally losing the Battle of Buxar in 1764, which led to the Diwani of Bengal and Bihar being handed over to the English. The Marathas were always keen that they should capture the places of Kashi and Prayag, which eventually went to the English because they were under Shuja-ud-Dawla at that time. When Shuja-ud-Dawla was defeated, he had to cede those places to the English. So this is what happened at that time. And the Marathas had received a big body blow after Panipat. There's a famous letter which says, "Do moti galat, 10-20 27 ashrafat or khurda ki ginti nahi." 2 pearls have been dissolved, 27 gold mohrs have been lost, and of the copper and iron coins, there is no account of how many are lost. It is not poetry, it was a stark kind of a statement of what the Maratha loss was. The 2 main chiefs, Sadashirao Bhau and Vishwasrao, were killed in the battle. 2 of the Sindhyas were lost. Yashwantrao Pawar was lost, Santaji Wagh. The whole galaxy of their military leadership, the administrative leadership, was lost in the Battle of Panipat. And after the Battle of Panipat, the non-combatants who accompany every army to this day, after all, we have only 4 fighting arms, all the others are supporting services. These people are lined up and they were slaughtered, and there were pillars of heads outside every tent of the Afghan camp. So this was a brutality which you find after the Battle of Panipat. And this knockout blow, from this knockout blow, it was Madhavrao who helped in the next 11-12 years by his leadership for the Marathas to recover. Madhavrao became the Peshwa when he was barely 16 years of age. His elder brother was killed at Panipat. He was probably the next Peshwa, designated Peshwa after his father died. And because he died at the age of 16, he had to take over. And the innumerable difficulties that he encountered in the first 2 or 3 years of his reign before he actually took control of the kingdom. His uncle tells him that divide the kingdom, give me half of it. So he answers that, whose kingdom is it? Who am I to divide it? So here is a person who's looking at the state, not as a private property, but as a trust, and he's the trustee and he wants to look after it. So this was the person who was actually at the helm of affairs at that time. And the buck stops there, which was of course Harry Truman's, was actually, you see it exemplified in Madhavrao's life. Now the main adversary of Madhavrao was Hyder Ali, whom he defeated thrice, and each time he defeated him, he got an indemnity of 32 lakh rupees from him. The final battle, of course, was in the last 2 years of his time. And during the research for this book, I have personally visited so many places which were involved with this battle. I visited Dharwad, Savnur, Bankapur, Anvatti, Chennarayana Durga, which I have personally climbed up because there's a plaque on top in Devanagari which says that Madhavrao Peshwa captured this fort. There is Madhugiri, there is Kolar, there is Dodabalapur, there is Bhairav Durg, there is Melukote and the Thonur Lake, because that was where the epic battle at the end took place, from where both Hyder Ali and his son Tipu had to actually run away from the battlefield in disguise. In those days it was not very commonly known who looks in which man. Another man was caught, an impostor was caught that he is Hyder Ali. Few days later it was discovered actually that he was somebody else. So this is the way he had captured the entire south and brought it back to the pre-Panipat period, when he reached the borders of Srirangapatnam. And in 1769, he sent another large army under 4 different commanders to the north. And in February 1771, after subduing some other enemies around that period, the Rohillas and the Jats who were opposing them, they finally captured Delhi in February 1771. And it was Mahaji Shinde who at that time escorted Shah Alam back to the throne. Now many people have been questioning me on this, that why did the Marathas put the Mughal emperor back on the throne? They had already captured it. For one, their Chhatrapati had no desire to go to Delhi and become the emperor. That he had spelt out very early in 1739 when Nadir Shah came on an invasion of India. Also, the Peshwa, being the prime minister, could not have taken over Delhi when his own sovereign was not ready to go there. So it suited them that they had a puppet Mughal emperor. Shah Alam was nothing more than a puppet, a phantom or a cipher, you can use those words too. And they, while he reigned, they ruled, because he had to follow whatever he was commanded. So that was the arrangement which actually was going on. But while Madhavrao was fighting with all these enemies in the north and the south, whether it was Nizam and Hyder in the south, or the Rohillas and Shuja-ud-Dawla and Abdali's invasions had ended by the time, while he was warning his chiefs, and there's a very epic letter which I published here, I translated it. he was aware that there is a silent adversary, and that silent adversary was the English. So he says of all the topicers are the Europeans because they wear hats, the English is on the rise. That's what he says in his letter. And they have already captured all the ports from Calcutta to Masulipatam to Chennai to on the western coast, they were Surat, up to Surat and these places. So you must guard against them and not let them enter Delhi. Because once he enters Delhi, in Marathi he says, "Te ukhalnar nahit." It will be difficult to unseat them from there, and the emperor will go under their charge. So these words of Madhavrao were not forgotten in the years to come. And you find that until 1803, it was Mahatma Scindia and his successors who actually controlled the Red Fort and actually controlled Delhi. So now this book is probably the longest that I have written so far, because as you go deeper into the 18th century, the number of resources that you have to write the book are increased, and therefore you have to put them all on paper. It's got about 576 pages and about 32 preliminary pages, 32 color plates with over 70 photographs. It's got about 1,300 notes, genealogies, several unpublished documents, photographs, maps, and which have taken, of course, several years to collect. That the oldest maps I've put here and pictures I've put here, I've got them as long back as 7 or 8 years back. Now, this size of the book, of course, is surprising, but then it's only a dozen years that we cover here, and subsequent books will probably be able to cover just 10 because the material keeps increasing. Now, finally, the one point I want to make about the writing of history, which is today divided into so many camps. And you may ask, what's the big deal? I mean, what's history? What's the big deal about? But it informs you where you come from. And the basic form of history is narrative history. All the other forms, the subaltern history, economic history, social history, they are built on this basic narrative. Now, unless you know the basic narrative, what actually happened, you cannot build these other narratives on that. And that trend has been for the last 30, 40 years to devote more attention to the economic history, the agrarian economies and so on, while the narrative history has gradually taken a backseat, which I think has to be corrected. So my intention over the last dozen years has been to write an evidence-based narrative history and put it before the people. And then those who are interested in the economic changes which took place over the years can take it forward from there. There are many books in English about the 18th century. Unfortunately, many of these authors are unable to access Marathi documents, and there are thousands and thousands of them. At least 100,000 Marathi documents are published. Some of them were published more than 100 years back, and they have never been reprinted. And there are millions of documents in the Pune archives alone, leave alone the Bombay archives, which are equally big. And there are several smaller archives. The Deccan College, Pune has got 40 lakh documents, which have not been read completely as yet. So these authors who are writing in English and who don't know Marathi, I found they usually tiptoe around the Maratha period. They avoid the Maratha period or deal with it in some kind of use secondary sources of other authors or British authors who have had their own interpretation of what the Marathas were. So I find that is what actually spurred me to write these books and to correct the balance, because that balance has been upset for such a long time that it has to be corrected. And therefore I use English sources, Portuguese sources, Persian sources, French sources in all my books, wherever I can, Rajput sources. And that alone can bring a composite history. India's history is very regional. You cannot have a Delhi-centric view that whatever happened in Delhi reflects the rest of India. In fact, I'd like to tell you that Akbar did not come to the south of India till the year 1600 when he attacked Ahmednagar. And Aurangzeb came down to the south only in 1685 when he captured Bijapur. And after 1707, they rapidly withdrew from there. So how many years was the entire subcontinent of India really under one ruler at that time? Very few years. But today when you read a Delhi-centric narration of Indian history, you are totally misled. You completely ignore the Vijayanagar kingdom, for example. You completely ignore the Maratha kingdom, which extended from Peshawar to Tanjore and Gujarat to the Maratha ditch of Calcutta. And you cannot study 18th century history without reading Maratha history, because they were there practically in every province, like barring probably the northeast and Jammu and Kashmir. They were probably in every province of India. So anybody who wants to write of the 18th century has got no choice but to go back to the documents of the 18th century. The only English historian who has come close to that has been Yadunath Sarkar. But he could do it because he was partnering with Riyasatkar Sardesai, who obtained the Persian sources from Sarkar and lent him the Marathi sources. And therefore that kind of partnership worked for some time. But even many of Sarkar's conclusions, especially about Abdali being a very great general, he completely whitewashes his other atrocities which he conducted in India. I mean, no great general can be a statesman. So that cannot be a criteria because you win a battle, that you become a great general and you don't have anything else to say about that time. Now, history writing stirs passions today like nothing else, and writing an unbiased history is rather difficult. I believe that if you write history, you must write a history that is Shashwat, which is a Sanskrit word which says it should stand the test of time. It should stand the fire of the truth that is in history. And 20 years later, there should be nobody who can say that this is what is mentioned here is wrong. So every paragraph, whatever I write, is substantiated by original documents, and therefore my notes are very copious at the end of the book. Because that has been my purpose. And you find that immediately after 1947, we were probably a new nation, and there was a fear that we had just undergone a partition and so on. So there were a lot of fissures within our country, not that there aren't any today. And there was a tendency to paper over these fissures and present a sanitized version of Indian history to the public, whether it's in schools or whether it's in the public domain. But today, at 75 years, I think we are a mature, strong, confident nation, and we should be able to look at history, the true history in its face, and identify what were our faults. We need not bring what happened in the 18th century into the 21st century. But not knowing history, you're culpable. It's an error not to know history as it actually happened and take away some different impressions about history. So I think that is very important, that a true history must be known to the people. And so this warts and all history is what I try to present in every possible way. And as I said before, India is the first indigenous empire after several centuries of Turco-Persian rule, and it is the last indigenous empire before the British took over. So this 175 years interregnum on a pan-India scale is very important when you look back at the 800 years of history, because it's very important in the civilizational and cultural sense today. If you had an uninterrupted Turco-Persian rule of 800 years, without this intervening period of 175 years, and without the British period, which kind of pretended to be neutral, we would be a very different people today. We would be a very different country today. When Abdali went back, they practically agreed that the Satluj will be the boundary of between the two powers, because the Sikhs had not made their mark as yet. Today you will find the Satluj river flows over 200 kilometers of the India's boundary with Pakistan. If that battle had not been fought, if the Marathas had decided to stay south of the Chambal, it is a hypothesis which I think it's a working hypothesis, that probably in 1947 the eastern Pakistan and West Pakistan formed, there would have probably been a bridge running across the Doab from West Pakistan to East Pakistan. Yashwantrao Chauhan, one of the prime ministers, the chief minister of Maharashtra, is said to have said that had Shivaji not been born, you would have found Pakistan on your doorstep. And that is the importance eventually of the Maratha period. And therefore, I hope that I can put it across to as many people as possible. At the same time, when you handle history, the author has to be dispassionate. I would compare it to a surgeon who is looking at a patient and not getting involved with his problems, but looking at it in a dispassionate way. So it has to be presented, read, understood, analyzed in a dispassionate manner. Again, I'll leave you with a last thought, that history is like a river. It flows. And it cannot stay frozen in time. There are people, there are movements which are going around, churning around this whole society, and you cannot stop them. So when these movements come, they take history towards one side and take it to the other side. So today, we are finding the pendulum which had swung to the left in the early years after independence is swinging to the right. And who knows where it will be 10 to 20 years from now. It is for the people to decide which way they want to lean and what the final truth is going to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that riveting journey you took us on, and we appreciate the efforts to put together a very unbiased narrative that you have so far. Now, before I introduce Dr. Vikram Sampath, time for the second question. Are you ready? Which are the two battles and the year in which Bajirao Peshwa defeated the Nizam-ul-Mulk? I think that was first, and then we have the second here. Sorry, you were. Can I just hear the gentleman in the back first? Palkhed and and the years.
1743.
Bharat years, sorry. Don't know the years though.
28 and 38.
38, yeah. But I think you got the two battles correct. Okay, would you Will you be able to collect the book at the end of it? Thank you. Okay. Dr. Vikram Sampath is a Bangalore-based historian and is the author of 8 acclaimed books: Splendors of Royal Mysore, The Untold Story of the Wodiyars, My Name is Gohar Jan, The Life and Times of a Musician, Voice of the Veena, S. Balachandar, A Biography, Women of the Records, Indian Classical Music and the Gramophone, 1900 to 1930, and Bravehearts of Bharat. His 2-volume biography, Savarkar, Echoes from a Forgotten Past, and Savarkar, A Contested Legacy, went on to become national bestsellers and were acclaimed by Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi. In 2022, Dr. Sampath was conferred the honor of being elected as a Fellow of UK's prestigious Royal Historical Society. He was awarded the Sahitya Academy's first Yuva Puraskar. He was awarded the Sahitya Academy's first Yuva Puraskar in English Literature and the ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York for his book on Gohar Jan. The book has also been adapted to theatre as a play, Gohar, by Lile Dubey, and is being adapted to a Bollywood film by Ashutosh Gowarikar. Dr. Sampath was among the 4 writers and artists to be selected as a writer-in-residence at the Rashtrapati Bhavan in 2015. He has a doctorate in history and music from the University of Queensland, Australia, and was a senior research fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. He's also an Aspen Global Leadership Fellow and an Eisenhower Global Fellow 2021. An engineer and mathematician from BITS Pilani and an MBA in finance from SPJ in Mumbai, Dr. Sampath is also a trained Carnatic vocalist. He has established the Archive of Indian Music, India's first digital sound archive for vintage recordings, is the founder director of the Bangalore Literature Festival, Indic Thoughts Festival, and Arth, a culture fest. I'm delighted to welcome you and say a few words.
Very good morning, everyone. And it's so wonderful to be back to the Bangalore International Center each time. Particularly today, I would deem it as a great honor, a privilege to be part of this event for the launch of a book of somebody whom I deeply admire, deeply respect, for the tenacity of his work, with a surgeon's precision, as they say, to, as he himself mentioned, what the entire goal of a historian and the way he writes or she writes needs to be. And I keep saying this not in front of you so much, but behind your back, which is how I think it needs to be, Dr. Kulkarni, that somewhere, I mean 50, 60 years from now, when a book like what I think T.C.A. Raghavan wrote, The History Men, it's a fascinating book on the history of historians, Jadunath Sarkar, Raghubir Singh, and of course Sardesai. If there's a book that's going to be written like that 60, 70 years from now, without doubt, I'm sure you and your contribution would be etched in golden letters in the annals of how Indian historiography is going to be. And I don't say this as empty praise. I'll substantiate, my claim subsequently. I must, of course, mention at the outset that quiz is very scary. If I were given this quiz, right from school times, I remember that history classes always meant kneeling down outside, and the maximum punishment in school in growing up years was in history, because for the life of me, I couldn't memorize who succeeded whom and which battle was fought in which year, which I thought was quite, the extraneous details that are fed to us, unfortunately, in a very insipid, listless manner, making history, which is so full of life, particularly in India, such a boring and listless kind of a subject that most people are waiting to get rid of this in their growing up years. So it's I'm glad some people are actually, they're still not getting the dates right. So that warms my heart that I'm not alone, even as a historian, to not remember and know dates and those details. Now, to get into I'd not get into the entire specifics of the book itself, because if we say everything that we need to about Madhavrao Peshwa, you're not going to buy the book and read it. So it's better that mystery of what the book has, and it's written in such a beautiful, riveting manner, that should be left to the reader. But I think it's important for us to locate and situate the entire oeuvre of work that Dr. Kulkarni has done and why it is important. And for that, I'd actually go back to the archives like a good historian and quote a letter which was written almost 61 years to be precise, after the fall of the Peshwai in 1818. This letter was written on 9th of July 1879, and this was a secret correspondence between Sir Richard Temple, who was the governor of Bombay, and the then Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton. Sir Richard Temple by then had served in several important positions in British India, in the central provinces, in the Punjab and so on, and also in the south. And the crowning glory of his administrative career was to be, made the governor of Bombay. And in a letter that he writes in the backdrop of a lot of agrarian crisis, the riots that happened in different parts of Maharashtra then, Bombay Presidency, Ahmednagar, Satara, Pune, and so on, and also the rising tide of an armed struggle against the British rule, he writes a secret correspondence. So one must assume that what he's saying is sacrosanct and true, because there's no reason why a head of state of one part of the country is writing something other than the truth to someone who is the head of the country then, the Viceroy of India. He says this, and I quote him: "It is commonly said that it was the Mohammedans whom the British displaced as rulers in India. This is truth only in a restricted sense. It would be nearer the truth to say that it was the Marathas in the main whom we, the British, displaced." And he goes on in that letter to further say, particularly about the Chitpavan Brahmins of Maharashtra, the same community to which the Peshwas belonged. He says this, and I quote again from the same letter: "Nothing that we do now by way of education, emolument, or advancement in the public service at all satisfies the Chitpavans. Education does indeed, in some respects, draw them towards us, but education is certainly making their minds restless. They will never be satisfied till they regain their ascendancy in the country as they had it during the last century. Never have I known in India a national and a political ambition which is so continuous, so enduring, so far-reaching, so utterly impossible for us to satisfy as that of the Brahmins of Western India, especially the dominant section of the Konkanasth Brahmins." Unquote. I'm sure this is a very politically incorrect thing to say in today's India, where caste and all of this, becomes a very important cauldron. But then this is our colonial master writing a letter to his master. And so, as I said, the authenticity and the import of that is very pertinent. And probably time also proved what Temple had written, because some of the greatest names in Maharashtra in the 19th century, whether it was Mahadev Govind Ranade, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Ganesh Agarkar, Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, the Chafekar brothers, and of course Vasudev Balwant Phadke, all of them belong to this community. And this was that same unending chain that was brought forth, that military zeal, that India was actually occupied by the British, not from the Mughals, but from the Marathas. That transition period where for a long time, as Dr. Kulkarni postulated, there was virtually no Mughal rule. The Mughal emperor was virtually a puppet at the hands of the Marathas, and it was from them that India was occupied. So when this is the importance, some of you may ask, especially some of the young readers, what is the big deal? Why should we read about the Marathas? There are so many dynasties, there are so many histories, so many stories which are unknown and untold. So why is it important? And that is where I think the work that Dr. Kulkarni has done and the body of the entire scholarship that he has produced becomes so important, given the fact that the Maratha history has not received commensurate importance, especially in the decades after independence. Sardesai, Jadunath Sarkar, and all the other historians that were mentioned all belong to another era, the pre-independence era. But after independence, today, if you actually look at where the Marathas, who were so important as the British letters themselves testify, what is the coverage and importance that they receive, particularly. And I'm going to the textbooks because that's probably the only brush that a young Indian would have with his or her history. Most of them, for fear of getting punished after school days, no one very few people have a pursuit in the subject. So if you actually go to the NCERT website even today, and most of the books are free there to download. If you download class 6, 7, 8 stories of our past or something like that, that is called. Class 7 is when the medieval and the early modern era is covered. You would be horrified to know that Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's coverage in a medieval Indian history book is only a photograph. With just 25% of the page about him, saying whose picture this is all about. And the Peshwas, about whom there are volumes that he has produced, probably occupy one paragraph, and that too in a very nonchalant manner. It's not the importance that was that I just tried to illustrate as to how the entire country itself was occupied from them. That importance is never given in the narrative that a young child reads. And probably the reason for that, as Dr. Kulkarni also alluded to, is this entire Delhi centricity of the way we look at our history. And the amount of Delhi bashing that people like us do, I don't know if we'll ever be allowed. We had a festival last week in Delhi where we were quite hospitably received, but I don't know, it's quite a peril. But then it's not, Delhi is not that geography, but I think it's a state of mind where, including the periods in Indian history that we talk of, ancient, medieval, early modern, who defines what are the cutoff dates for these? These are all defined by who sat on the Takht of Delhi. 12th century or so would be considered as the 1206, when the Delhi Sultanate was established. That is considered as the beginning of the medieval era. It's the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, which is considered as the start of the new, the early modern era. And then, of course, post 1857, the modern era. So, including the organization, the Indian History Congress, and all these other, organizations, they classify Indian history too and its various epochs based on Delhi history. And in that narrative, I think large swathes of India get, completely wiped out or completely not given the importance that it deserves. The Maratha history being one. And as people coming from the south of India, a lot of us have this angst that most of the stories from our part of the world hardly receive the importance in that larger narrative of what the story of Bharat is. The Northeast also, for example, the Northeast, the Ahoms who ruled for 600 long years in Assam, invincible, kept Assam as Asama or invincible for so long. They also do not have, I'm sure we don't remember reading about them in our growing up years in our history textbooks. 2-3 Ahom kings we can't even readily recollect when asked. So that is the unfortunate paradox or tragedy of the way Indian history and history writing is done in this country. And that is where I think the role of someone coming from the outside and storming the bastion, and in that I share a lot of similarities with Dr. Kulkarni, where you need people who are not dyed red in the wool in the barracks of JNU maybe to actually have a look at your past with a dispassionate way. Whatever ideological tilts and other tags that may be put to several of us who are trying to revisit this. It's not revisionism. And history, as he said, is a flowing river which constantly needs revision and reinterpretation. There's nothing, as a very famous American historian had said, every account of history is an interim report. Every generation looks back and, drawing from its own experience, tries to illuminate the past. So, as in how new documents and new, data emerges, the history also that we write changes. But particularly about this aspect, about why various regions of India were not given their due, the reason is not very innocent, that, that it was just not looked at sufficiently and so on. And constantly, right from Al-Biruni, who said the Hindus do not have a idea of history writing itself, to the British too, who derided our entire maintenance of historical records, the truth is somewhere else. Because Kashmir, for instance, the Raja Tarangini that Kalhana writes, it's literally a river of all the kings who ruled, 500, 600 years of pre-Islamic rule of Kashmir, and then added with other people like Jona Raja and others. The story comes till the invasion of Kashmir by Akbar. So you have a corpus of Kashmir history, and Kashmir is not just the political state today, but a large part of northern India, moving even into western Pakistan and Afghanistan and so on. So that history is available. Down south, the Cholas, they maintain their accounts, not one or two, but in multiple, in triplets sometimes, on palm leaf manuscripts, on coins, on temple walls. For those who say Indians do not have a sense of documentation, on the walls of the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur, you have the names of all the Devadasi singers and dancers, almost 200 of them. The names, the addresses, the emoluments, their mothers' names, all of that actually etched. What more documentation are we talking about? And most of these accounts, as I said, are in multiple languages, in Tamil, in Sanskrit, maintained so beautifully. You go to the northeast, Assam, as I mentioned, has a documented history of the region from 4th century BCE. And from the time the Ahoms came to power in 1226, you had the Burunjis, which were documents of their history. Coming particularly to the Maratha history, I think this is one area where no one can complain of a lack of documentation. The copious amount of documents that were left behind in terms of letters, the Bakhars, the Povadas, whether it was literary genre or actual documentation, there was everything that was there. The Peshwai Daftar has, I think, as he mentioned, thousands and thousands and perhaps lakhs of papers documenting every little detail. And these letters which go in and out, the correspondences, the war strategy, all of these are maintained not only in the Peshwai but also in the larger Maratha confederacy. If you go to Indore, the entire Malharrao Holkar era or the Ahilyabai Holkar era, the Maheshwar archives, they have all the administrative details meticulously maintained. So when different parts of the country, whether from Kashmir to Maharashtra to Tamil Nadu to Assam, north, south, east, west, there are documents, why was it that these were ignored? Why was it that these were not looked at, and we had to look only at the few kilometers and regions around Delhi and who ruled there? So that begs a larger question as to what the agenda itself is, as to how you present history, and I think Dr. Kulkarni alluded to that too, as to what the tone of Indian history had to be, particularly in the aftermath of partition and a nascent country being born. But today, when all these different voices, a soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance, to quote that much famous speech, when all these different regions of India are claiming that our story also is a very important part of this narrative of the history of India, you cannot sit back and say this is revisionist, this is communal or whatever else that is spoken about. This is a very legitimate assertion of a large groups of people who say, hey, I think my story matters too in the larger narrative of Bharat's history. And I think particularly with the Marathas, considering that they ruled over such a vast, Atak se Katak tak, and large parts of the south and so on, lot of misnomers, misunderstandings abound about their history. You talk to any Bengali friend about Maratha history and they'll bring up the Bargi invasions, the atrocities that were committed there. So that is where unbiased books like Dr. Kulkarni's, which deal with primary sources, research-based, unemotional, even in the manner in which he speaks about his subject. It is not as if he's becoming a lawyer or defendant of the protagonist. To keep that distance and then bring out the facts, because finally a historian's job is to illuminate the archives. So when he does that, I'm sure in your subsequent books, the Bengal invasion is something that needs a lot of thorough documentation and coverage. In this own place, Mysore Maratha relations have been a matter of a lot of, it's gone through a lot of ups and downs. Marathi that way was the court language in one of the court languages along with Kannada, because a lot of Marathi Brahmins, the Deshasthas, were part of the Wadiyar court to keep the accounts. And so with Kannada, Marathi was also used. And of course, when Tipu Sultan founded his Sultanate-e-Khudadad, all of that was removed and Persian was replaced as the language. So that umbilical cord was also there, but there is also another side of the constant skirmishes between Mysore and the Maratha rule. And Bangalore, as he mentioned, was a Jahagir of Shahaji, and later on it moved on to Chikkadevaraj Wadiyar, where from Ekoji, he actually gives it away to Qasim Khan, a Mughal commander who occupies Bangalore, and Chikkadevaraja then buys Bangalore for a price of 3 lakhs. Today you won't even get a studio apartment in Bangalore for 3 lakhs, but the whole city was actually bought on lease or Izara of 3 lakhs by Chikkadevaraja Wadiyar. And through that, considering the pushback that Chikkadevaraja did to a lot of the Maratha invasions, Aurangzeb and he get together and form an alliance, and he's literally given a signet ring with Jagadevaraya, or king of the world, by Aurangzeb, almost as a bulwark against Chhatrapati Shivaji and his rising power. So there were all this politics, which is, we need to look at these historical characters not as sacrosanct saints, but as politicians of today, where the Shiv Sena can cohabit with the BJP at one time and then go to the other extreme, complete other extreme, and likewise in Bihar or wherever else, where the politics makes for strange bedfellows. So something very similar happening even during that time, where Aurangzeb and Mysore form an alliance against the Marathas, and later on, particularly there are other stories related to Mysore Maratha history, which I think someone like Dr. Kulkarni in his future works, I'm sure, will bring light to, because these are brought out as the major fissures or the controversial areas. The whole issue of Sringeri and Melkote. You spoke about Melkote. There's Buchanan's account too, which talks about how 30 years even before what Tipu Sultan did to the Mandya Mayangars of Melkote, the entire area was laid waste during the Maratha invasions of Madhav Rao, in fact, and most of the Brahmins from the area had fled. Cattle, everyone was taken away, and it was a deserted land when Buchanan visits it 2 years after Tipu's death. And similarly, the whole idea that the Pindaris of the Maratha army actually plundered the Sharada Mutt in Sringeri, that becomes a very, so I'm bringing out these issues which I think are landmines today in contemporary politics, where you pit this as a binary of a Hindu versus a Muslim and that kind of a conflict. But we have, and I'm in the process of my own research now on Tipu Sultan, 30 odd letters between the Jagat Guru Shankaracharya of Sringeri and Tipu, where Shankaracharya is actually writing to him saying, I am doing a Shata Chandi Homa and a Sahasra Chandi, Japa to defeat the Marathas, who and help you get victory. So it's a very, very, very complicated 18th century, cannot be defined easily by definitions, yardsticks of today, of religion, of secularism, of communalism, nationalism, all these different yardsticks that we have today. And the very glut of characters, as someone who's area of interest is the 20th century and 19th century India and not so much the 18th and 17th, it's a landmine for me to see, you know, how many different characters emerge. There's so much confusion, so many wars of succession. The Carnatic Wars itself, if you look at, you know, from Nasir Jung to Basala Jung to Muhammad Ali to Chanda Sahib, then the British coming in with Robert Clive, Dupleix, the Marathas and the Vodiyars, Hyder Ali, Tipu Sultan, the smaller Rajas of Malabar, of Coorg. It's a potpourri of disaster, 18th century, you know, India. And so in that maze, to make sense of it, to actually navigate this entire forest of information and to mine it in a manner that it comes to audiences in a manner that is palatable and digestible. That is also where Dr. Kulkarni's books stand out, where he puts the entire context. Everything in history comes with a context. That Sringeri thing, there is a context. The Melukote thing, there is a context. If we do not look at the context, it can become a very, very political issue, which we can fight today for our petty politics, you know, political brownie points of the left versus the right and this party versus that party, and Karnataka going into elections now in the next couple of months. All these characters are going to keep coming, you know, in news channel debates. We already had something about the Peshwas and Marathi Brahmins and so on by one of the political leaders. Sometimes you wonder whether Aurangzeb, Tipu Sultan, all these characters are fighting elections because they are the ones who occupy, you know, all the mainstream attention. But I think history needs to be more sober. It needs to be left to sober outsiders, preferably, who can look at all these, you know, very confusing, conflicting strands of information in a time period which was very different, which we cannot define by today's standards. Try to make sense of it and present to the maximum possible extent a cogent kind of a picture. So to that extent, I'd heartily congratulate Dr. Kulkarni on this new childbirth, and I wish, like Gandhari, you have probably 100 kids to celebrate. I don't know I don't know what that will do to you and, you know, your health and stamina, but we wish you all the best and the best of health and the best of vigor to pen many, many more books, because this is, as I said, one very, very important epoch or era in India's history which has sadly been ignored, not written much about, and we as a nation, I think, owe a debt of gratitude to people like Dr. Kulkarni for bringing it back to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. How are we doing? A quick thumbs up, down, or if you're doing great, jazz hands. Fantastic. Okay. So we have our final question. Last opportunity to get your hands on a book. And on stage, how are we doing? Oh, good. Okay. In which year and from which army did the British capture Delhi for the first time ever? Anyone? Sure. In which year and from which army did the British capture Delhi for the first time ever?
Maybe 1803 from Maratha Army, Mahadaji Shinde.
Yep. Great.
It was not Mahaji, but you're right. Mahaji died in 1794.
Yeah, that was 1803 from the Marathas. So we do have a book for you at the end here. Okay. So wonderful. That concludes our little quiz for today. And thank you so much for being active participants. I would now like to introduce Mr. Vikram Limsay. Mr. Vikram Limsay is an applied business strategist and is the CEO and principal consultant at Helicon Consulting. He obtained his MBA from Symbiosis Institute of Business Management, Pune. A speaker at many forums, his writings are carried by leading journals and leading national media on economy, public policy, society, and business. He offers a unique insight often contrarian to commonly accepted beliefs that stem from his medley of experiences that include professional, entrepreneurial, academic, and media. An avid multi-sports, yoga, and active lifestyle enthusiast, he lives in Bangalore and gathers his worldview through reading and exciting travels. I now request Dr. Vikram Sampath to felicitate Mr. Vikram Limsay. I'd like to thank Mr. Limsay for agreeing to moderate the book discussion now. So over to you.
It's often the easiest job is of the moderators when I'm sitting with doyens like yourself. So it's my proud privilege today to be around here on the stage with Dr. Kulkarni and Vikram Sampath. I have read your books. I think the 18th century that we're talking about, the late 17th century and the 18th century, apart from what was happening in India or in the Maratha kingdom, was a very interesting part worldwide. I think there was a lot happening all over the world. If we take Europe, it was just about the throes of the Industrial Revolution was starting off in UK. France was just getting along with its Cultural Revolution. In the US, they had just done the declaration of their independence. The US Constitution was getting made just when all this was happening, which Dr. Kulkarni and Dr. Sampath talked about. South America, unfortunately, the Europeans had already reached, so the pillaring had happened. The Aztecs and Incas had disappeared. What else? North America generally followed the lines of whatever happened in Europe. The Western African kingdoms like Ashanti and all, they were highly developed kingdoms around that time, and a lot was happening them. East Africa was trading robustly with India. There was a lot happening at that point of time over there. What are happening in China? The Qings were right in the middle of the Qing dynasty. They were into the expansionist mode. The geographical boundaries of China's were getting made around that time. Again, if you move far to the east, the Tokugawa shogunate, the Edo period, the great Edo period was also in the middle of its consolidation at that point of time. So the 18th century was, in my view, one of the most interesting parts of history world over. And at that point of time, such brilliant stuff was happening over here in India. But as a casual observer of history and a much interested observer of history, what I find is it was just one confused era. It was like painted like just one confused era. There were many of these chieftains and local rulers fighting amongst themselves for 100 years, while a lot of other things were documented, right, from the cultural history of Europe, Africa, everywhere else. In India, it was painted as if just another 20, 25 people fighting for 100 years. And that's what happening. That now brings me to the first part of my question, and I think I'll throw this first to Vikram Sampath before I come to you, Dr. Kulkarni. Why was it painted in a manner that it was? Let's get the elephant in the room and call it out. What is the real story? Why it was painted in the manner that it was, that everything was subdued, and it was painted as if some confused era was happening around the 18th century?
I think the reason for that was that there were multiple accounts. I mean, just if one studies the history of Mysore itself, which I do, you need to confront yourself with, the Maratha records too. You need to look at Mysore itself, pre-Hyder Ali, post-Hyder Ali. You have a Kirmani's accounts, you have a Kannada accounts of the Wadiyar court. Then you have the French accounts, you have the British accounts, and each one is going to put the story from their perspective, particularly when they are, at war with each other, and there is that confrontation between all of them. So for a reader today, for a researcher today who's sitting in the 21st century, away from the theater of drama, the theater of war that they were in the midst of, you're looking at all this confusing conflict and trying to make sense of it, which is what I closed with, to make sense of that era itself and to bring it out in this manner. That itself is a big challenge. I noticed that his book starts with this dramatis personae, all the people who are there, the glut of names, the glut of information, and each one ruling for a couple of months, couple of years, and how the European powers were actually using this as a ploy to depose one versus the other. You had a long drawn where the Anglo-French rivalries in Europe spilt over in South India in the form of the Carnatic Wars, and how that actually brought into its fold almost all the major players. And Indian players were also unwittingly using these people to settle their scores, thinking they were just another player in the larger chessboard, which they were not. So I think that is the whole reason why today, when one looks at it from a 21st century lens, it does look extremely a maze of confusion and fuzz, and a lot of conflict.
Yeah. And thankfully there's kind of a renaissance, not just in historians, detailed historians such as yourselves and Dr. Kulkarni coming out with their writings, but I think also the ecosystem has become a little more conducive to talk a little more openly about that period at this point of time. So thankfully that's happening. Dr. Kulkarni, on you, your book I have read. One of the most amazing things about, and I want to make that point as a reader, and I read extensively, one of the most amazing things about this book is that we've always mentioned these copious sources that have been used, maps, references, reference material. But what I found really interesting in the book is that it weaves so beautifully in the narrative. It's not like every time I have to look at the glossary at the end of the day and say, all right, this happened, this later. It's just part of the narrative. I'm sure all the readers who pick up the book and have read the book or are going to read will find that as a very unique aspect of your writing, Dr. Kulkarni. Coming to this particular book, let's give this thing. I'll stray a little bit from this 12-year period, but also come to the book later. What would you call Madhavrao Peshwa? Let's put all of them in one after the other so that it's easier for the audience. What would you call, like, you've Bajirao, what would you call him? A warrior? After that, Madhavrao Peshwa, what would you call him? A strategist? What would you call Shivaji? Just in short, all these 4 or 5 milestones, people who've achieved these milestones, what would you call them?
Coming to Chhatrapati Shivaji, he was the founder, and he is called the Great. And the genius of Chhatrapati Shivaji was never ever repeated in the annals of Maratha history, because he was the man who laid the constitution of the state, a centralized rule. I always call him a king who cared for his people. In numerous letters you find him writing to his local chiefs saying that the Mughal has come and he's going to come to this fort. So please take your people down and take them down to down the ghats, where the Mughal evil will not touch you and they will be safe. And keep yourself safe too. So this kind of letters you find repeatedly, instructions to his subedars. Now there are less than 300 original letters of Chhatrapati Shivaji which are available today, which went out from him kind of. And from that you have to construct a personality of what kind of a ruler he was. And you find that you never find a single example of cruelty or any kind of... So he was obviously the greatest of all the rulers who took place. He was a sovereign, and he had all the entire kingdom was in his control.
He started the whole thing. Then Bajirao, what was his...
Bajirao was eventually a prime minister. And Chhatrapati Shahu was very strong, though he was not very active. He was definitely the monarch. And in the first few years when he writes to Bajirao that now you are going here and there, you are not informing where you are going, then one day I will remove you from a Peshwa, then you will come back to me and saying, why have you removed me? This was in the pre-Palkhet days, before he defeated Nizam for the first time. 11 years later, you find the same Chhatrapati Shahu writing about Bajirao when somebody asks him a question that, can you tell your Peshwa to do a thing? He says, but will he listen to me? So it is to Bajirao's credit too that he never overstepped his jurisdiction as being the prime minister and the foremost general of those times, who never lost a battle. Now, one reason why I say he never lost a battle is because he knew how to fight, of course. He knew where to fight, he knew when to fight, but more importantly, he knew when not to fight. So if the situation is not conducive to a battle which he will win, he would delay it till the circumstances became right. The Palkhet is the most classic example of that. That's why Montgomery calls it a masterpiece in strategic mobility. It went on for 7-8 months till he found the Nizam in a place with a much more powerful army, a very strong artillery, found him in a place where he could trap him. His victories were mostly bloodless. You never find him slaughtering people for the sake of it. His idea was the war is diplomacy by other means. And once he gets his objectives, he was not interested in senseless slaughter. Same with his brother Chimaji Appa. When he captured Vasai and Sashti from the Portuguese,
when the Vasai battle was captured, the Marathas had lost 12,000 men in that battle versus the Portuguese. But when the Portuguese surrendered, he did not, kind of take it out on them. The women, the children, the Portuguese who had surrendered, they were allowed to leave the fort of Vasai with their band beating. And they could board their ships which the English had lent them to go to Goa with safety. Incredible. So this was the kind of, they called it the Bharati Yuddha, which the surrendered enemy has to be given amnesty and treated accordingly, which you didn't find after Panipat, for example. Nana Sahib Peshwa, more than a warrior, his face can be divided into two parts. First part, he was very much under his sovereign, who was Chhatrapati Shahu. Then, because Chhatrapati Shahu didn't have children, there was a civil war, and practically Nana Sahib became the sovereign, at least the ruler, the executor, I would say, the chief executive officer of the Maratha kingdom, and that is when the Maratha kingdom reached its maximum extent from Peshawar to the south and Bengal. But if Nana Sahib had died a year earlier, before Panipat, he would have probably been acclaimed as the greatest Peshwa ever. It was the 21st year of his reign when he himself was in very poor health, could not go on campaigns. He was suffering from tuberculosis. He had lost 40 pounds in a matter of a year or so, which is the time when the Battle of Panipat was fought. He was distracted. He was not able to make decisions correctly. That is the time when the Battle of Panipat was fought, and that has been kind of held against him, because why did
the narrative built was that after he
Now Madhavrao was practically, from the day he took over, did not have a king to really answer to, but he had his uncle to answer to. So first 2 years he had to put his uncle, he had to grow out of the shadow of his uncle, and you find Raghunath Rao writing to Madhavrao's mother ki Chiranjeev means Madhavrao, amchapeksha adhik zale. He has become more than me after the battle of Rakshas Bhuvan, where the Nizam was defeated. So then Madhavrao came into zone. It was a matter of 8 years that the Maratha empire, which was shrinking with enemies on all sides, he took back Delhi. He went right into Pathargarh. He managed to defeat the Rohilas of Pathargarh, the children of Najib Khan, and right south till Srirangapatnam, where the battle of Moti Talao was fought, or Thonur Lake as it's called, and where Hyder and Tipu were given a decisive defeat. Had they been captured at that time, had they not been able to run away in disguise, that would have ended the chapter of Hyder and Tipu there and then. So these 4 or 5 people faced very vastly different circumstances. But of these, I would say that Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj had the toughest adversaries to combat, while Madhavrao had the most difficult circumstances which he had to face. But these people all overcame the situations, and they adapted to the circumstances which they had. Because the circumstances change, you cannot compare them with each other.
True. In fact, to make an empire and to resurrect the empire are two completely different things. I think Madhavrao resurrected again from where it went down, and that's credit due to him. Couple of things on the relationship between the Peshwai and the Chhatrapati. I mean, if you could throw some light on that, because it seems to be so smooth, hard to believe, but smooth.
Till Nana Sahib was the Peshwa, up till the death of Chhatrapati Shahu, the Peshwa always deferred to the Chhatrapati, to the extent that for almost 6 months in 1747, when Chhatrapati Shahu was worried about the succession, that I am not going to live for too long, he stripped Nana Sahib of his Peshwa's office. Nana Sahib immediately handed over the seals of office to the Chhatrapati, and he lived in a forest in a tent all by himself. And finally, after 6 months, Chhatrapati Shahu realized there is no other able person. He made a search. Is anybody else able to take over the reins of the empire at that time, which had spread all over? And Nana Sahib said that whatever decision you have to take, you must take early, because there are matters that are pending. If my enemies come to know that the Peshwa has been removed from office, there will be a crisis in the empire. So you must take it. And he was called back. And he proved his loyalty by even picking up his sovereign slippers and taking it to him. And that is how Chhatrapati Shahu reinstated Nana Sahib in his place. Now, after Chhatrapati Shahu's death, he had no children. The Chhatrapati of Sambhaji of Kolhapur had no children. And there was a kind of a vacuum, the leadership vacuum at the house of the Chhatrapati. Queen Tarabai, who was that time about 75 years of age and who had been living in Satara, practically you would say, because 1713 she was deposed at Kolhapur. Till 1730 she was in Kolhapur. Then she came to Satara because she preferred to live there. But at all times she was never in power. And by then, the kind of politics of the Maratha Empire had spread so far and wide that for Tarabai to really take over the reins of the empire and run the show was not a practical or a viable option. At the same time, the replacement for Chhatrapati Shahu who had been brought into Satara and who was actually, Tarabai said he was my grandson, who was living in a secret manner in the village. He was unable to take the reins of office. And finally, when he began listening to the Peshwa, Queen Tarabai herself was annoyed with him, and when he came to visit her in the fort, she kind of put him under house arrest, which he remained for another 10 years. So the Chhatrapati's house kind of became, since Tarabai could not the power, or exercise her power, and the Chhatrapati was kind of in a house arrest in the fort, it became, there was some rebellion for 2 years. Damaji Gaikwad came down to Satara, he was defeated by Nana Sahib's men. Tulaji Angre was another person who wouldn't accept the Peshwa, even he was put in, with the help of the English, he was defeated. So these few aberrations aside, from 1750 onwards, it was Nana Sahib Peshwa who managed the affairs of the kingdom. And although later on there were attempts to bring back the Chhatrapati, Madhavrao, for example, Nana Sahib in the last few months tried to bring the Chhatrapati back, which again Queen Tarabai refused. And later on you find that enough provisions are made for the Chhatrapati to live comfortably. But ultimately, there's a bit of politics, there's a bit of ability, everything is involved. And you find that from the king, like in Japan you said the shoguns, the Peshwas were like the shoguns, you can say. And after Madhavrao, you find even the Peshwa ends, because his brother is assassinated 9 months later, and then the next Peshwa comes out, is appointed to the Peshwa at the age of 40 days. So you find Nana Fadnis and Mahatji Shinde becoming the, they became in charge of the entire empire.
Regions, yeah.
So it kept on coming downwards after that.
It's interesting. So it's circumstantial, not by any other reason, right?
I mean, there are all kinds of imputations made these days, because I don't want to go into the reasons of that.
Okay. So the interesting, drawing from that, one of the things that we see is that the Marathas always preferred appointing the local rulers, including, in the north and everywhere else, as the kings of that particular location. Why did they not put their own people over there? I mean, the Holkars and Scindias and Bhosles seems to, even Patwardhans in Karnataka seem to have done well, where their own people were there.
Partly true, because for Malwa, Bundelkhand, parts of it, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Nagpur region, Berar kingdom, or even north of the Tungabhadra, the Patwardhan estates, Jamkhindi and all these places, they were ruling themselves. But regions beyond, they allowed the local ruler to continue ruling the region as long as he gives them an indemnity every year in the form of a chaut. Now this chaut was not a Maratha invention. It was an invention of the Portuguese. When the kingdom in the Konkan region was submitted to the Portuguese, they told him that we will take care of your defense and we will not invade you, provided you pay us a certain indemnity every year. When this kingdom was taken over by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, he continued the same system of chaut, and that's how chaut came into the Maratha kingdom. And the principle was very simple, that we will take care of your defense, and that's what the English did later on when they signed the subsidiary treaties, that we will take care of your defense, in exchange for which we will not attack you, but we will not let anybody else attack you, for which you give us a fixed amount of chaut, which was not necessarily 1/4 of the revenue, although it's called the chaut. It varied from year to year. And the entire episode of Bengal, I've tackled it in my book on Nana Sahib. In 1740, it was Alivardi Khan who usurped the legitimate Nawab, who was the dynast of Murshid Quli Khan. And when he usurped the region, the people who were with Murshid Quli Khan's dynasty, they came running to Nagpur and said, please come and help us to get rid of Alivardi Khan. That's how Raghuji Bhosle actually entered Orissa and Bengal. Otherwise, they had no intention of going there. And when they confronted Alivardi Khan, they initially brought him to his knees. And they said, all you have to do is pay us 12 lakh rupees chaut a year. And if you do that, we will restore you to your legitimacy as the Nawab, and we will not attack you. Alivardi Khan resisted that. So from 1741 to 1751, there were Maratha invasions in Bengal. In 1751, finally Alivardi Khan accepted the Maratha demand, paid them 12 lakh rupees chaut, and the Marathas did not enter Bengal after that. Unfortunate that they didn't, because in 1756 you find Clive entering it and taking back Calcutta from Sirajuddaulah.
They never got involved in the local administration as such, right, the Maratha. Once they actually took on a territory, they just took the south and then gave a protectorate kind of thing, but never got involved in, and that's different from what the English did later.
Except for the regions, as I told you, parts of Malwa, Bundelkhand, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and parts of Tungabhadra, Orissa, these were administered directly by the Marathas. And there's a Count de Modave, who was a French official who was here, there's a beautiful quote by him as late as 1776 that the Marathas take care of all their obligations, and people who are their allies, who have accepted their hegemony, if you want to call it, they are always protected by them. But the enemies, the people who are their enemies, they always devastate their territories. Because it was like, those days, even today, what you see probably in Ukraine, is that if you want to threaten a ruler, the battle is not fought on the battleground. It is fought in the civilian areas of the city. If that is happening in the 21st century, there is no reason for 18th century to be any different. When there's a battle, when Aurangzeb came into Maharashtra, the entire region was ravaged. 100,000 souls died in a year because of the famine and the war that took place there. No, these were not people on the front line, they were civilians. So this is an inevitable byproduct of war.
I found a little, the Maratha rule a little understated, much less than what that could have been. Okay? But that brings me to another question, and probably I'll wind up after one or two more questions. The impact of the Marathas cannot be physically seen. In fact, you know that last night I was jousting with somebody on some intellectual Twitter debate that you can't see physical impact of the Marathas in the north, to which I said that, whatever I said, and then you endorsed that for me, thankfully. Can you put that on the table a little bit about
Actually, most of the kings today are recognized because of the monuments they leave behind. You see the Taj Mahal and you remember Shah Jahan, and the Red Fort is Shah Jahanabad and so on. You see the Sikandra and you remember Akbar. So Sher Shah Suri is remembered for his mausoleum in Sasaram. The Marathas never built that kind of those kind of buildings. Their buildings are probably, if you want to go, you have to go and climb those 500 forts which were in Maharashtra, built in basalt. And probably their palaces were very simple structures. They were not ornamental. You see the Shaniwar Vada built in black basalt stone. The places they lived in were made of wood, which burned down later on. So this was the kind of architecture they left behind today. So it was only later, I would say, in the 1790s, when Tipu was defeated in 1792, that they had 4 years of peace till they fought with the Nizam in 1795, which you find the first signs of a Maratha Renaissance. Because that is when you find Nana Fadnis asking that so-and-so artist, please make paintings from me from Delhi. That artist has gone to Lucknow, so he's not there, and trying to embellish their palaces. Madhavrao Peshwa, in a secret correspondence, so-called secret correspondence, writes to Nana Fadnis, are you making my pleasure palace on the bank of the lake for my wife? How far has it been completed? He's on a campaign in Karnataka. He's asking that. Or a Gopal Rao Patwardhan, he's worried about his Diwan Khana, which is being built in Miraj. Unfortunately, he never could take time off from his campaigns in Karnataka to go back home. And when he went back home, he just peeped into the Diwan Khana next day and the man dies. So they were not the kind of people who had this approach of leaving behind monuments, as Percival Spear, I quoted the other day in Arth, he's an historian who wrote the history of India along with Romila Thapar. So I mean, I cannot be accused of quoting somebody who is not a leftist, who says that the palaces and mausoleums of the Mughals were like Marie Antoinette's cake. You could see them, but you could not subsist on them. And the entire surplus of the country was probably wasted here. He says the Mughals preferred a garden to a canal, and their nobles preferred a tomb to a well. So the entire surplus of the kingdom, of the empire, there was much economic activity but little economic progress. Because that's what you see today in the form of monuments. The Marathas didn't make any. So that is why the visibility, unless you go to Hampi and you see the ruins over there, so-called ruins, you don't realize there is a Vijayanagar kingdom, which once upon a time that was the most magnificent city in the world.
I guess that physical impact was not seen because of the way they were.
You see Brihadeshwar and think of the Cholas. Yeah. But if you don't have Brihadeshwar, you would not imagine what the Cholas had done.
Thankfully, at Kashi, much was done. A lot of Maratha influence in the Kashi Ghat. Vikram, your thoughts on the Maratha Empire versus the other empires, indigenous and Indic empires that existed in the country. Some points on that. What are your thoughts on that? What are the distinct factors that distinguish?
Before I get there, Vikram, I'd like to add to what he said and your question itself. Visibly, monuments may not have been there, but I think you can't compare the Maratha period with the other indigenous, empire period, which was not at the crux of so much of chaos that was happening in the country. They were an indigenous empire in a very, very difficult time, and at that time, for the empire to actually enunciate both a very clear sense of a nation state itself, the borders of that nation state, as he mentioned, with the Battle of Panipat, and also the Hindu consciousness itself. You spoke about the elephant in the room, and that is the elephant in the room. That, the Hindavi Swarajya, the Hindu Samrajya that was established, and this consciousness that needed to be established, whether it was an Ahilyabai Holkar who was renovating all the Jyotirlingas, right from, the most important we know only Somnath and Kashi Vishwanath, but all the others also, her role there, or to connect culturally, the north with the south, from Kashi to Rameshwaram, from Gujarat to Kamrup, getting water of the Ganga to as prasad in temples in South India. So culturally uniting the country at a time when the country was going through what it was going through. And in this book itself, he mentions, he has the extract of Madhav Rao's will, which is, I think, so
fantastic.
important. That here's a man who's 26 or 27 when he dies of tuberculosis, and at that time, to his successor, he leaves the commandment that, among all the other things, get back Kashi, Prayag, Ayodhya, which had gone off into the
English.
So Awadh and later the British. So the very idea that these are our sacred spots, these needed to be brought back. I think that very consciousness for India at that time to come out for particularly the Hindu population of the country, I think that is a very, very intangible contribution, impact, which I think is much more than some monument standing here and there, which can come and go, but and no doubt then that what I'd mentioned, that the British actually feared that here is where the seeds of nationalism are going to come. Here is where the seeds of pushback, because you have that consciousness already about a nation, about your community, about your faith. The pushback is going to be so much more than a community which is in coma.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very well said. In fact, in 1857, that's the pushback which probably started. Yeah. I think leave a couple of questions for the audience. We've already taken a lot of time. Some hands going up. We'll take 3 questions. One from... Yeah, sure.
This is for Dr. Kulkarni and not meant to be loaded. One is, I started my formal working career in Kolkata, and I was quite surprised to find there that the word dacoit and the word Maratha were synonymous. Although this might be the subject of your next book, if you could answer that. The other question is talking about sources, and this is much more recent. I repeat, it's not a loaded question. Why was the Bandarkar library attacked?
The first question about Bengal I have already addressed in my last book, actually.
I haven't read your book.
Yeah, the extraordinary epoch of Nana Sahib Peshwa has probably got 6 or 7 chapters purely on Bengal, and that deals with the entire Bengal invasions, the reason behind them, how they came about, and what was the outcome eventually, and even Battle of Plassey and so on. Everything has been covered in that book. So I think the answer would probably, if you want to really go into it, that would be found there. But as far as the word dacoit has not been used, but Gangaram in his Maharashtra Puran, he has described that the granaries were burnt, there was no food to feed the baby, and everybody is running away from the villages and cities, because who is coming? The Bargi is coming. That is a description which he generally describes. Now Gangaram wrote this 10 years after the invasion of 1741-42, and this is a normal consequence of any battle, anywhere in the world. So I would not say it was something different. But what has brought it into light has, because that particular document mentions it, of a person who was probably those days, from his language it is said, is probably born in East Bengal of today, and has written about that period. Now, if you look for every battle that took place, you will find narratives which are far worse than this. But it is probably, some people would probably like to point their fingers at this particular episode, for reasons which I would not like to speculate on. The second part about Bhandarkar Institute is not really my area of expertise, but my understanding is that probably there was some book which was published by an American author in which he quoted something which was taken to be quoted with the help of some scholars in Bhandarkar. Now, whether this was true, whether it is false, has never been substantiated, because to the best of my knowledge, no proper inquiry has been conducted into that attack. And no, that case has not been taken to its conclusion. It's still hanging somewhere in the...
That's not what I was asking. Yeah. The Bhandarkar Library is a repository of so many documents that are important for the country.
Actually, Bhandarkar's library is more of, I would say, Prachin Vidya. I mean, it's Prachya Vidya Institute. It's got nothing to do with Maratha history. So I think it was more of a soft target is what I would look at it. I really would not say that it has got any... There was no reason to attack Bhandarkar actually at that point in time.
I agree, that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, it's a Prachya Vidya Institute. It doesn't deal with history at all.
Okay, we'll take two more quick questions and then answers.
So my question is that we talk about Mughal generals being all these barbaric and slaughtering people, slaughtering their enemies. So someone like Manu Pillai argues in his books that barbarism was the norm. So can we definitively say that the Peshwas or the Chhatrapatis were any less barbaric? And I'm not talking specific instances where they allowed people asylum. As a general trend, was it just the Turkic invaders who were barbaric, or was it a norm back then? And we are singling out these Mughal emperor or Mughal generals who have been barbaric.
Yeah, I haven't read his books, but I think war itself is barbarism. I mean, that's one thing the human being has not been able to get out of his system as yet. And we are seeing it all over the world today that international power politics are being played at the cost of somebody else. So this is probably something which I would say that the Marathas tried to use war, as I gave examples of Bajirao, as a diplomacy by other means, as far as possible as they could do it. But eventually when you have to put across or you have to get rid of an oppressive regime, is there any means by which you can do it without fighting, at least in the Middle Ages? They had to fight for it. And if you have to fight with somebody and to defeat somebody, there's going to be some killing involved. And if you label it as barbarism, so be it. But a barbarian usually is not sure about the ideology that he's following when he kills somebody. Well, a person who is fighting in an army or for a particular king, he may be at times going out for more territory or something like that. But when it's a battle like the kind which Marathas fought, the reasons for that were lay somewhere else. It was not just the gain of territory. Later on, when they became the emperors of India, sure, they captured new territories, they took south from them, they took revenue from those people and so on and so forth. So India was still in a pre-nation state. I mean, today you think that why did they go and attack Bengal? Is it a part of India? But it's a part of India, yes, but that consciousness of a nation state has evolved over the last 300 years. You have to go back to the kind of consciousness which people had in the 18th and the 17th centuries. And they probably thought of only their district or their region or their people who speak the same language or the same. So that was the idea behind their actions.
Just two sentences I'd like to add to that. Of course, I mean, in war, this unfortunately becomes collateral damage and civil, collateral damage that you spoke about, which is unfortunate, but that's the times that we lived in at that time. But I think the distinction is when there's also a theological component to those attacks, when there is specific targeting of people of communities of faiths which are not your own, which adds to the casualties of common civilians. When there is specific targeting that is done of places of worship of a particular group, like a Tipu Sultan's farmans or his very sword having the writing that this sword is to be quenched by the blood of the infidels, that is going beyond just, very innocent, casual, civil collateral damage. That is specifically with the task that those who do not believe in a particular way of life or a particular theology, they deserve to be further slaughtered. And the history of a lot of these non-Indic faiths, if I can say that, and their invasions is testament to that, and that we have to acknowledge that and address it.
Also, the post-battle behavior also gives a lot of insight into that aspect.
I mentioned that about Panipat, but for example, what Abdali did in Mathura and Vrindavan in 1757 was by no means a strategic objective. It was he was told that please go there and wage a holy war. And he was killing people who had come there as pilgrims or the sannyasis of that place. And it was considered to be a kind of meritorious act to do that. And every person whose head was cut off and brought here was paid 5 rupees or 3 rupees, depending on the number of heads cut off and brought. So it was that kind of a war that was fought. After Panipat, people are lined up and their heads chopped off, which you rarely find in Maratha annals.
Last one.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Satya Prakash. First of all, Dr. Kulkarni, Dr. Sampath, all of us here and the whole of Bharat is greatly indebted for the kind of service that you are doing, investing your personal time and trying to correct the history of the nation. Thank you so very much. My question is, I mean, you may have explained elsewhere in your books or in your talks, but for the benefit of us here, what are some of the political or social reasons for the consciousness or the rekindling of that, desire for the Haindavi Swaraj in the Marathas, if you could explain us. At the same time, why do you think it did not happen elsewhere in the country? For example, with the Rajputs, they were militarily so powerful, they were so close to Delhi. There was a political vacuum in the 18th century, as you were explaining. So why do you think it happened with the Marathas? Why no other geography or people in India could rise like the Marathas and try to orchestrate the events that happened in India?
I think the rise was primarily attributable to one man, and that was Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, because he was the person who began this whole thing, and he awakened the Marathas to get and do this national duty, as you call it. Now, as far as the part of why the Marathas Hindvi Swarajya was not taken forward in the following century, I have not yet seen a single letter which mentions that Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj has used the word Hindvi as such. It has been used by others. Of course, the aim was very clear that the Mughals had to be overthrown and Bijapur had to be overthrown because these were the people who were oppressing his people. So he was very clear about that. But the actions, when he goes and builds a temple in Goa, which had been demolished by something, or later on in Nana Sahib Peshwa, that Jyotirling of Triambakeshwar, which had been demolished and a masjid built in its place by Aurangzeb, is demolished, and a Triambakeshwar temple is again built there, which took 30 years to build and which stands there today. So when you see these acts, or when Madhavrao Peshwa in his will writes that you must, or even Nana Sahib in his time when he's negotiating with Shuja-ud-Dawla, that I will give you the wazirship of Delhi and you must cede Kashi and Mathura, Kashi and Gaya as well as Prayag to us. Or Madhavrao in his will mentions this, that this should be done. And he would have probably done it had the English not marched up to Banaras because of the misadventure by Shuja-ud-Dawla. So this does not, this shows by their actions and their words that this concept of establishing a kingdom of the indigenous people, as I call it, of Indians, was very much in their mind, and they had to overthrow a foreign power which was imposing their will and their ideology on the Indian people. So by their actions you see it. You don't need to repeatedly, like today you keep getting that on the TVs and this thing that we are fighting for Hindvi Swaraj. It's their actions that speak for themselves. And that ideology remained with them. For Madhavrao's will is written in 1772, which is more than 100 years after the period of Chhatrapati Shivaji. But this concept remained with them. But at the same time, the adversaries and the situation was so adverse in the 17th century that this was more pronounced, the feeling. In the 18th century, the adversaries had mostly been defeated. So this statement became a little subdued when they said it.
We'll close it, please. I think we've showcased almost 1 o'clock. Okay, we'll take one more. Come, yours.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for everyone coming here. So I have 2 questions. First question is, in the Maratha century, so you have mentioned about the letter extract of Chhatrapati Shivaji, mentioning that while any kind of economic activities are always welcome, but make sure that they're not being given easy access to the place close to the shore, make them they are settled. If at all they need settlement, make it deep into it. That foresight is quite, it was quite genius, we can say, Chhatrapati Shivaji, but at the same time, a free pass for the foreign traders in Surat or other ports, which I thought maybe eventually cost us the nation to the foreign power. So what was no thought from the Mughal side, like, okay, giving them a free pass from the major cities, it can eventually harm us. No thought from their side. And how did Marathas think about it post Chhatrapati Shivaji, while economic activity, especially regarding the ports? Yeah, thank you.
Post Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, the Bombay was not threatened by them because the English did not encourage conversions, forcible conversions like the Portuguese did. So northern Firangan was taken away from the Portuguese because they were oppressing the Hindus in that region. That is the first thing. Bombay was worried that they will now come to us, but the Marathas had no intention of attacking Bombay. For one, the Bombay traders, as they were called at that time, were a good window for them to trade their goods abroad. So they never had intention of attacking Bombay. As far as Surat is concerned, Surat was never under the Marathas, though Shivaji Maharaj attacked Surat twice. In 1759, Nana Sahib Peshwa had sent his army to capture Surat. And that time the English also sent their ships to Surat. And the Nawab of Surat decided to hand over the castle to the English. And that was the first time when the English and the Marathas were at loggerheads with each other. But after Surat had once it had been captured by the English, they never let it go. So as Surat city as such never came under the Marathas.
Thank you. I think we'll wrap it up. We are already at 1 o'clock. Thank you, Dr. Kulkarni, for a great show today, and Dr. Sampath, thanks for gracing the occasion. And thank you all for coming over here. With that, we'll close it now.